Well, you will see that we are slowly moving through MIT. We've had the theoretical construct for the relationship between art and science from the School of Science. Now we've had our presentation from the School of Architecture, and we are moving on to the School of Engineering. There is probably no better representative from the School of Engineering in representing men's at Manus, mind and hand, than Richard Polich, class of 1965, who is president of the Talix Foundry for Arts Casting. At the Talix Foundry, sculptures, monumental sculptures by many of the best known artists have been casted, are being casted. Works by De Kooning, Stella, Nancy Graves, Joel Shapiro, and many, many others. I think to describe what Dick does there, I've been privileged to be to Talix twice, and I would really like to take all of you to Talix to see the foundry, but we will have Dick come and show us pictures of it. Maybe next time we should go to the Louvre and go to the foundry. But there was a profile about Dick in the current Technology Review, which I hope that you were able to see, and I want to quote one passage from that. It says, "Dick is multilingual. He speaks structural engineer, sculptor, and welder fluently." Please help me to welcome Dick Polich.
Well, good morning. We all need a little second to let all that settle down. That was just a wonderful talk, and what I'm going to talk about is a little bit different. I'm an engineer, a metallurgist. 30 years ago, I worked on a project with Mert Flemings, head of the Materials Science Department, the goal of which, modestly stated, was to unite technology and art. We did indeed have a resident sculptor, Al Duca, who still is here in Boston. We all worked together to adapt and modify industrial techniques to the making of art. 24 years ago, I started Talix, a place to make art, whose very name comes from the material we deal with, metallics. In that 24 years, Talix has grown to be the largest caster fabricator in the world, with over 100 people working in 85,000 square feet, making art for artists all over the world. In fact, in the past year, we've installed art in Luxembourg, Munster, Germany, Rome, Vancouver, and Tokyo. My hope today is to accomplish three things. First, to give you a tour of the foundry and show you what we do. Secondly, to talk about a specific problem for artists, going from a small maquette to a monument, the problem of dealing with scale. And then finally, end up with a discussion of how artists, engineers, and fabricators work together. So let's begin. The artist who wants to make metal sculpture needs to find at least four things: space, tools, technology, and craft. The artist will always make art, but where he makes that art, the place he picks, will affect how the art looks and how it is made. Let's look at the first slide. Is there a pointer here? This is it. Okay, space we have plenty of. We have about 85,000 square feet. We have 46-foot ceilings. The next slide. Let's see now. Not sure where that is. Oh, there we go. Thank you. The next slide shows the main bay of Talix. We have some Frank Stella stuff over here. There's a Liechtenstein over there. That's Audrey Flack. That's a stainless steel sculpture by Jeff Koons. The scale of the place, it's about 65 feet across here and about 300 feet down to the other end of the foundry. The cranes have about 35 foot clear under the hook and can lift up to 100,000 pounds. Tools also we have plenty of. The next slide. Here you see us out in the yard assembling a sculpture by Alex Lieberman. It's a Corten steel sculpture. Its dimensions are 50 by 50 by 40 feet. It's an extraordinary sculpture in that you can walk inside this sculpture, and it's very unusual in that way. The next slide, we show some technology. This is a sculpture that's in the National Gallery, a quite famous sculpture, and its surface is terrible. And this is one of the things that we have worked on at Talix to help sculptors achieve their goals. The next slide. These are the grain sizes of 3 different cast bronze alloys, and while I was at MIT, I did work on bearing steels, and it turns out that the same kinds of things that make better bearing steels also make better surfaces for sculptors. And so in the next slide, you see some of the stuff we have done where the cosmetic appearance of the surface, the perfection is so vital to what the artist is trying to get across. In the next slide, you see craft. I mean, this kind of story is really the story of Talix, where we have analyzed and identified those interactions between artist and craftsman, where they are really working together to make art. We have also got processes, steps in the process that really are very little different than making an engine block. And so we have tried to separate those processes, mechanize them, use the latest techniques, and try to keep this marriage of technology and craft going along. In the next slide, you see a triptych by Helen Frankenthaler, and these really are lithographs set in a cast stainless steel frame. These are about 7 feet high. One of the problems in this sculpture was what to do with the backsides, and we tried putting fabric and putting wood and various other kinds of things. And then the next slide, please. We went to using patinas, and patinas are very painterly kinds of things, and you use brushes and solutions. The solutions are chemical, but the techniques are the same. In the next slide, you see Helen working on the bronze backs that went onto the triptychs, and this process is very much like using watercolors. The colors are transparent, they blend into each other, and there's ample opportunity for accidents, happy accidents to occur. In the next slide, you see one of the triptychs, and this is the backside, and you can see the incredible designs and colors that she has done for the back of the screens. In the next slide is another one, and then in the next slide again, another design and colors. And I must say that at the exhibit where these were shown, only one of the triptychs had the lithographs facing out, and then the lithographs were all facing the wall as they showed all the backs. And so There were some happy foundrymen at that show. In the next slide, this again is a little bit of technology and a lot of craft. One of the things that is going on here is that we are brush plating gold onto the bronze. What happens then is that the patinas will not take on the gold, and so that the artist gets this kind of extraordinary transition from here a green into the rich goldy color. I think the next slide shows a. Oh no, this is another case of craft coming through to help the artist. The woman there is Mary Frank, who does clay sculpture. One of the things that really troubled Mary was she wanted to do marble, and of course fired clay is very fragile, and the possibilities for putting it outdoors are limited. She wanted to do metal sculpture, but the surfaces were hard and just reflective and really bothered her, and so we worked out this approach where we got a kind of matte surface with a patina that came close to the original clays. In the next slide, I'm going to now talk about some of the problems with scale. These are 35-foot figures in Roslyn outside of Washington, D.C. It's what you see as you come up to this building. The thing that goes on when an artist is faced with making a large-scale monument, and as Professor Morrison talked about, the hands and the eye working together, artists invariably work at a size somewhere between 1 foot and 3 feet, something like that. I think the hands and the eyes coordinate well, and that's the size. Now you've got to make something, though, that can be outdoors, something that'll go in the world, and the world is a big place. Well, typically, if I took a piece of paper and crushed it in my hand and threw it on the table, you would sense the force that had crushed it. You would see the folds, the lines, the kind of energy that's in that piece of paper, in that crumpled paper. I now take it, and an artist says, well, make it 10 feet by 10 feet. What happens is that somehow now all of those folds and creases and lines have moved apart, and there's a lot of information that has to be put back in to make that work. And what is possible to have happen is that this large model, it becomes an imitation thing, and it really doesn't work. In this case, the next slide, please. We were taking, as a starting point, a painting, and we're working with kind of big geometric, simple shapes. The next slide. We have here, again, in the bay of the foundry, and we are making this structure. We've got the problem of hurricane winds. You'll see that it's quite delicately poised on its toes, so we have to put a lot of structure inside this. The next slide, please. Here we are in the main bay of the foundry, the figures standing together for the first time. You can see all of these are really weld points where the surface skin is welded to the structure inside, and there indeed is a copy of the original painting, and that is the artist admiring her work. The next slide. This is what you see as you leave the building, and I think this is just a very successful project. It's a wonderful kind of thing to see coming and going. In the next slide, we have a sculpture by Roy Lichtenstein, and this is a brush stroke. The next slide shows this sculpture at I think it's 22 feet in the foundry, and then the next slide shows it going into a building in Paris, of all places. But again, you can see that there are big, simple forms. The colors are well defined, and this sculpture goes up to a larger scale quite readily. The next slide. This is a two-dimensional painting by an artist named Richard Pousset Dart, and I was really quite amazed to see in one of Mr. Pay's slides, which showed a topographic map of Paris, how this related to that. It seems close to me. One of the things, I don't know if that was Mr. Pousset Dart's inspiration, but one of the things that we had to do now in consultation with the artist was to figure out what's up and what's down. How do we make this three-dimensional? And so we made it into a clay model. Next slide, please. And you can see now, this is the model in clay. It's gone from a painting about, I think it was 5 feet by 6 feet, to a 12 by 12 door. This door was for the museum at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And in the next slide, you see the door set in a limestone wall. The next slide shows the inside of the building, and the door is pivoted in the middle, and so it rotates on a central hinge. And I think we have one more slide, which shows again the door set in the building. Again, I think a very successful enlargement. Next slide. This is a sculpture by Tom Otternes, which went to Germany. Here is the maquette. This is about 3 feet high, and we're enlarging it to 8 meters. The construction here is quite simple, stainless steel tubes with bronze elements inside them. The next slide, please. Here you see it in the main bay, the foundry at its full height. I think that is the model there, and again, here is the sculpture. Again, this sculpture lent itself readily to being enlarged. Next slide. Here we are in Washington, and what's going on here is that this is the installation of the Joel Shapiro sculpture at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. This sculpture was 23 feet high. The next slide shows the sculpture in the foundry. Shapiro uses wooden forms. The sculptures are almost minimal. They're these simple wooden forms that go together. This is a figure that it's a double figure that represents a kind of resurrection theme. You see here the actual size of the elements that we cast. There was a real problem here in that when the sculpture got this big, and we used wooden beams to cast off of, the wood grain did not carry. And Shapiro finally went back to the sawmill and dinged one of the teeth of the saw and then ran it through the sawmill and left a pattern that was strong enough to come through at this scale. The next slide shows Joel, that's Joel, the artist there now, adjusting, locating the sculpture, and this is just interesting that it shows the kind of involvement that goes on between artist and fabricator, engineer. Next slide. This is a sculpture by Gifford Proctor, and this sculpture is about 30 inches high, and it's Washington at Valley Forge, very, very dramatic. It was on its way to 20 feet. In the next slide, you see the enlarging machine at the foundry. This is a pointing device. The original sits on this table. The thing you're making in clay works over here. There are two styli. the center line of the tables and the center line of this arm is on the same point. There's a pivot back there, and so that this makes one similar triangle similar to this. So if this distance is 1 and this is 5, you can get a 5 times magnification. This technology goes back to the Renaissance, so it's being displaced by lasers and devices like that, but computers, excuse me, computer-driven cutting machines. At this scale, it's just very difficult. The equipment is so expensive. Next slide. Here we have the body. These are Washington's elbows, and what happens now is we really start to get into trouble because we've got this enormous expanse of fabric or cloth or whatever it is, and it's a real problem as to what to do to keep the sculpture interesting, to keep your eye moving. This sculpture was really never cast at that scale. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Here we have an artist, Vilem De Kooning, and De Kooning did this sculpture, which is 9 inches high, and then it was enlarged 4 times to 3 feet, and then 4 times to 12 feet. And in the next slide, the kind of technique that De Kooning was using was really working these things in his hand, squeezing clay in his hand, and you can see in the next slide, you can see this kind of very tactile thing that's going on. And in the next slide again, you see it even better. Now, these sculptures, when they were first enlarged, the first enlargements were really scrapped because the information from there to there was not there, and the artist had to come back and work very closely with the enlarger to get something that kept your eye moving, that kept your interest. The next slide, please. This is Frank Stella, and Frank Stella is certainly one of the top artists of our time, and Stella is here working on a clay, and he looks like he's working with a rake. Well, he is working with a rake, and Stella's a really cerebral, available guy who will discuss with you and tell you what his problems are. And he's got a clay here. The total clay is about 12 feet across, and he's trying to make a mark on it that's appropriate to the scale. And Stella feels that the hands are too small, too weak. The gestures they make are too timid. I mean, what he's looking for is something that will show force and movement and energy, and so I've actually seen him go in there and jump on the clay with both feet. I mean, it's a real problem, and in the next slide, you see how Stella is starting to approach it. This is part of a sculpture which you'll see in a minute. It's about 25 feet high, this one element, and in it we have an enormous number of new forms, of new surfaces, of things that Frank is trying to do to keep you interested, to have a surface that's dynamic and changing and interesting. In the next slide, here's another sculpture, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. But this dumpster is actually part of the sculpture, and I agree. But I'm going to talk about that, about where an artist gets his images. And one of the things that Talix is a resource image bank for artists. And almost everything we use in the Foundry, Frank has put in one sculpture or another. The next slide. This is another sculpture. And these are also painterly things. I mean, Stella started out as a painter, and a painter can take a 12-inch wide brush and go in and cut out big parts of his painting by overpainting. And Stella is looking for that same kind of energy and possibility for change. The next slide, please. This is that sculpture. It was at one reviewer described the sculpture as looking like an airplane crash, and that's funny in a way, but it's also true. I mean, Frank is looking for gestures, and you take a big steel tank and you crush it. And so you put the history of that event in there, and we respond to it and sense it. In the next slide, again, some of these things that are going on, and then closer in the next slide, closer to my heart. Here we are trying to make one of these forms, and Stella is so experimental and so open that I'm going to talk some more about him in a minute. But here we are. He has assembled this pile of junk, and sometimes, I mean, there's no other word for it. It really is a lot of junk. But we are pouring 5,000 pounds of aluminum on this sculpture, on this stuff, to make a new kind of form. I mean, this is a kind of casting without molds, and what happens is we get directional patterns. The things get knit together, and we have here really a new mode of expression. And again, going back to Professor Morrison's talk about the real world, this is very real world, but it's also dreamland. So. I think that's the last slide. No, I have some other slides. And again, going back to Professor Morrison's talk, and we did not discuss each other's talk, but here, one of the things that really binds me as an engineer to the casting process is the process itself. And in early times, people who worked with metals were shaman. They were magicians. I mean, after all, the first metals, meteors from heaven and Mother Earth, disgorging gold nuggets, and so the metals have always had a very powerful role in our lives. And this is these are ceramic shells that we're going to fill with metal, and we preheat them. Because they're so impermeable, and we have to keep the metal molten long enough to fill out. The next slide shows us tapping off into a crucible of molten steel, and then the next slide is the actual casting process, which is violent and wonderful and dangerous. Next slide. Again, more of that, and then the last slide is the molds have been poured and they're set aside to cool, and the next slide is just entropy taking over and everything getting back to the same temperature. Okay, I think that's it for the slides. I want now to talk a little bit, after now we've seen how the Foundry looks, I want to talk about how it works. But first, it should be understood that the art being discussed is limited to the plastic arts and sculpture in particular. We will begin by making a clear distinction between creating, fabricating, and engineering. Creating, while difficult to understand, is fairly easy to describe. It's what the artist does when he works, when he expresses himself. What it is not is something made as a means to an end, something made to a preconceived plan, or something made by imposing a new form on a given material. In other words, art is made deliberately and responsibly by people who know what they're doing, even though they don't know in advance what is going to come of it. To create a work of art, the artist must have in him certain unexpressed feelings and the wherewithal to express them. Making a sculpture then has two stages: making the plan, which is creating, and then imposing that plan on certain materials, which is fabricating. Thus, when the engineer makes a plan, he, like the artist, is creating. It is not art, however, because it has a preconceived goal. Remember, in art, you don't have a preconceived problem to solve. You're trying to express something. Sometimes the engineer, as in my case, wears two hats. He makes the plan, but then he also serves as the fabricator. Let's look at fabricating. The fabricator needs an idea of what is to be made. Typically, the artist presents an artifact in a plastic medium and wants it transformed into metal, perhaps at a larger scale. In the simplest case, the engineer is not needed at all. The deal is really between artist and fabricator. In this case, the artist has a very specific problem which can be solved by the application of an existing technology. So when does the artist need the engineer? Well, in at least 5 instances. No artist and probably no engineer can be familiar with all the material processes available and the number of materials an artist can use. In my own case, I listen to the artist's intention and then describe a number of different ways, different processes to achieve the artist's goal. This conversation often occurs very early in the process of creating a work of art. Then there is the near obsession to be novel, to do something never done before. Casting and fabricating are really fairly straightforward. New technologies appear and are used, but for the most part, solutions of this type combine unusual or offbeat ways of doing things. For example, casting aluminum or bronze around stainless steel, stopping the anodizing process at a point where the artist can paint colors rather than dipping, using plating techniques selectively, welding metals together with different color welding rods. These suggestions sound simple, but they can be of great use to an artist in achieving a unique effect. Then there's the exchange of information between artist and engineer. The artist wants to know why something happened, what things can't or won't work, and perhaps most importantly, which things might work. It is sometimes difficult for an artist to explain what he's trying to do, for it may not be completely clear to himself. The engineer-fabricator must be a good listener, able to pay attention and intuit what the artist wants. Providing a source of imagery. Talix is visually a fantastic place. Artists come to Talix to see all the different work being made, feel the energy of the place, and are enormously stimulated and motivated to create new works. And finally, make it all cost-effective. In the end, everyone has to deal with the costs. Let's return to the fabricator who wants and needs an image of what is to be made. The artist, as creator, sometimes does not have a strong sense of how important it is for the fabricator to have that final idea available. Minus it, confusion and muttering result as artist and fabricator slip past each other, pursuing their common but different goals. Fabricating is important to the artist, but in a different way than for the fabricator. Fabricating gives the artist the opportunity to identify elements he may want to use in his composition. The fabricator works from a model, a drawing, a sketch, some kind of guide, while the artist has none of these and only gets exact when he's completed, when the sculpture is finished. Another sticking point in the push-pull between fabricating and creating is that the fabricator cannot provide the artist with elements of imagery. Only the artist can decide what images he wants. He may recognize and use some images from the work of the fabricator, but only after he has understood what has been made can it have a place in his work. To summarize, the artist is expressing an emotion, a feeling he is not conscious of until it is expressed. The engineer participates in the process by making a plan to accomplish the artist's vision. The fabricator follows a plan with a clear objective and artifact as the goal. I want now to talk about how different artists work. Most artists come to the foundry looking for advice and consultation on how to achieve a specific result. These artists have mostly resolved their work in the studio and have well-formed ideas of what they want. Often they will have discussed with the foundry particular aspects of a project long before it is completed. In fact, the discussions often affect how the sculptures are fabricated, as technical advice becomes a compositional element which the artist may use or discard. Some typical foundry responses for artists are as follows. Roy Lichtenstein, the pop artist, wanted his sculpture to have an industrial finish, like a galvanized trash can, to keep the pop image, even while using the very permanent and expensive process of casting. Nancy Graves loves color. Nancy comes to sculpture as a painter, and so we did enameling of the cast bronzes. And she also liked direct casting, and so we figured out ways to cast lobster claws and flowers and other flora and fauna with her signature touch of fragility and metastability. For Richard Pousset Dart, we've already seen how we took that two-dimensional painting and turned it into a 12-foot by 12-foot door. These are some of the things we've done for various artists, but the artist I'm going to focus on is the aforementioned. With his assistant Earl Childress, chooses to work directly and at scale at the foundry. This is a bold, expensive, complicated work, but what it does is gives Frank the possibility to assert artistic influence at every possible stage of fabrication, and therefore clarifies how one artist can and does work. For Stella, a major goal is to include as much information as possible in his work, to make it as rich and full of character as possible. He wants the complexity of history and chance, and he is not bothered by the source of the richness. For example, human beings always bring the promise of enriching a work, not only by their actions, but by accident as well. Frank will ask for something to be done. Bend that piece of metal. Cut that piece into 4 elements. The logical question is, okay, what angle is the bend to be? Do you want it symmetrical? Are the cut pieces to be equal sizes? These questions Frank never answers. He says, bend it, cut it. He's looking for richness. Frank is open to everyone's ideas and suggestions, looking for that idea he could never think of himself. Perhaps the cutting or bending of the material will be done in some new and interesting way. If it doesn't work, if it isn't interesting, he dumps it. He will not compromise. Working for some artists is like making a product. This group of artists is trying to achieve a specific result. But Frank Stella is composing images, building the sculpture, feeling it go together. When Frank is at work, making images, accepting some, rejecting others, there's a real sense of fitting the specific elements to each other, making them feel right as well as look right. Historicity of elements is what Stella wants, not in the traditional way, but in a new way. The old way was go to the studio and do trial and error experiments. Now there are too many possibilities, too many complexities. The artist needs help to understand the possibilities, so he goes to a fabricator like Talix. Even so, Stella is very unusual. In his quest for richness, he is eager to use any possible imagery the process of fabricating offers. This is not what most artists seek. Frank thinks that the process of testing does not give people ideas. People get ideas by thinking. Frank says if the artist has a novel idea, he feels good. If he has an original idea, he is happy. People value expression. They don't have enough of it. Art gives back something, a notion of the nature of the material, of casting, of man using tools to shape and form materials, a sense of all the forces, a lot of them at work. To make something is to act like God. To make, you must use force and your mind. One of the big differences for Stella between art and engineering is the value of an original idea. An art An idea in art is only good once. Thereafter, it is repetition. But a good engineering solution can be used many times, over and over, until a better solution presents itself. Sometimes engineers feel artists are capricious and self-indulgent, when really what they are responding to is this fact that they must avoid repetition. What are some of the ways Stella works that can be applied to engineering? For starters, take his openness to ideas other than his own and his own quest for richness. Stella doesn't care where ideas come from. He wants work rich in ideas. To some, this might sound like plagiarism, but it isn't. There's a difference between using what exists as a springboard for your work that is the basis for your work. In my personal experience over the past 10 years, I can report that everything we use at the foundry, tools, cutting tables, workbenches, dumpsters, drops, that's what's left after a form's been cut out of a metal sheet, all have been included in Frank's imagery. Of course, the ultimate drop is another artist's scrap sculpture, which of course no one can use, but it is tempting for what could be a better foil, a better alternative view than another artist's sculpture. Next is Frank's effort to stay uncommitted, to keep as many possibilities open as possible, no matter how many problems this causes the fabricator with his need for a final vision, a goal to be achieved. Remember, the fabricator's skills are his knowledge of the means necessary to achieve a given end. There the artist is, substituting images, testing, trying to see what works best, sometimes unsure until it is done, while the fabricator writhes. How can one work for someone, he thinks, who doesn't seem to know what he's doing, while in fact the artist is doing exactly what he must do to complete the project? In conclusion, I want to do two things. The first is to review what the artist, as typified by Frank Stella, does, and then to draw some conclusions as to what might be applicable to the education of the young engineer. First, what I see Frank doing, what I will call the artist's way. Get as much history and richness as possible into the art, including the processing and the evidence of man working with tools. Do not commit too soon. Stay as open as possible, as long as possible, to other solutions, for it is in the making that one sees fulfillment of his ideas. Be aware of changes and the effect those changes have. A brief tale. We were making a lot of stainless steel castings for Stella in 304. A project for another artist came in that required 316. As an engineer, I'm accustomed to looking at these materials finished. And finished, it's almost impossible to tell them apart. And the differences in composition are not great. So to give someone 316 is like being moved into first-class seats if the tour section's been overbooked. We made castings in 316s for a while and then switched back to 304. Almost immediately a cry went up, what's going on? It turns out that 316 in the as-cast condition looks very different from 304. Something we engineers had been totally unaware of, but not the artist. Finally, invest self. If the artist's idea fails, the artist fails. If you want to get more out of something, give more of yourself. That's the way of the artist. All of them make sense to me and deserve serious consideration by young engineers. But there's more. Bright young people come to MIT to learn the latest and the newest technology, what works and how it works. In the study of science and engineering, a discarded or disproved idea is just that, discarded. Interesting, perhaps, only in where it was wrong. In engineering, there's also a real-world test. Questions totally inappropriate to works of art get asked of the engineer, like, what's it for? Did it work? Did the bridge fall down? Contrast that to art, where discarded ideas and artists can and do reappear. And certainly in art, there is no sure test for the quality of art. What can happen then to the young engineering student, which does not happen to the artist, is that he may overvalue the contribution of his teachers and either ignore or not develop awareness of his feelings and the importance of expressing those feelings. We need to, and I hope are doing so, as evidenced by all of us here today, make young engineers aware of the importance of including their own feelings, their own expression in the solutions to problems they will face in their careers. We can make that more possible by providing opportunities and making sure that these opportunities are important to our community for our students to express themselves. Or failing that, provide them with frequent opportunities for aesthetic experiences. Whether or not this will make better engineers can and will be debated, but art and aesthetic experience will do what it always has done: enrich the individual and give a historical and aesthetic perspective, an artistic dimension to our students' understanding and aspirations. And given the ever-growing power of engineering, perhaps it's not too wild to suggest that this new engineering will give creators like Stella compositional liberties unimaginable not so long ago. Perhaps one can even imagine students being taught, as I have learned working as an engineer for artists, function can follow form. Thank you.